Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are going to kick off the third and final of this series of three in our designing and managing a project, especially for natural areas. And really excited to have three guests joining us again from diverse backgrounds, and should be an interesting conversation as we try to wrap up this idea of designing, managing, running, and closing out a program with today's session. In particular, today focusing on what that closeout might look like in the audit, and then also what it will mean for using the information you gleaned, or whether it moves on to another project. But we're gonna discuss that a little bit from the manual. Again, for those who did not join previously, I'm Stuart Sarkozy-Bonacy, and I am moderating the panel today, and we'll introduce our speakers in a moment after I do some setup and a little bit of review from last time. So just as a reminder, especially if you'd like to go back and look and you didn't join us for any of the previous sessions, this is part of a longer combined series or two series, and this one in particular is the final of the three from September to November of this year. But there were also a previous set in that case only in French, but you can pick those up as well, and this previous sessions by looking at the Conservatoire de l'Étoile YouTube channel, and we'll mention that again at the end for you to have for reference and to share with others if you'd like. So we went through a bit of a journey starting in the three sessions. For those that have followed along through all three, you should have already received the technical guide or the methodological guide and the certificate of participation as well. And then we will, there we go. And then we will also want to just talk a little bit about where we've been seeing all of you come from. We didn't get a chance to do this last time, but I thought it was important for those that are who are joining us from different places in the world, and in particular coming from different types of institutions. So this is a kind of very broad sweeping look at who you are and where you're joining from. As you can see in green, a number of island locations, lots of coastal areas from the descriptions in the organization, and a mix of this sort of how, the things that you're doing to lever or leverage the way that this work is continuing in various themes. And most of you that are joining are from NGOs of some type, various forms of nonprofit organizations or regional NGOs, and working in the space of all those listed below and more, especially in natural areas in the environment, as you'd imagine, because that was more of the focus. But there are some of you that are focused on culture and heritage, economic and social development, tourism, and other types of things. So a really interesting mix globally. But also in terms of the kinds of ways that you're working on all of this. So part of the internal team, I mentioned who I am, and then also joining us, we have Marta Ferretti, who's a project director at Smilo, which is the sister organization to the Conservatoire, and Smilo is the small island organization that I'm involved with as well, as part of the evaluation committee. And then Cyril is joining us, likes to stay off camera, but can be seen in some cases, but is working in the background and doing the work of keeping this all together and the technical support. This is just so that you can see, you should be seeing the screen on the right-hand side on your platform. We're showing you how to use the question box. We will have two spaces where we'll pause for questions, and also then more time at the end to do so as well. We may not use those times directly if we're going long, but I will also have questions for our panelists, and it's a good. I mean, we can have a much more open dialogue. So feel free to add your questions in at any time. And just a note there to the speakers that when they're on, you are seen. So I'm setting the stage. We're going to have our stakeholder and speakers talk in a minute, and then what we'll do, it's a bit of a shorter piece, but we will talk about both of the last two stages in phase 5, all of the sort of assessing, submitting, and recording, and what comes with that with a funder, and some of the diversions that you might take. And you'll hear stories potentially that support that in various ways from our speakers as well. And then the question of what it means to sustain and promote the results, and whether you're sustaining it for the organization or the project, more money, more fun, more activity, other funders, and things like that. So we'll get into that a little bit. So feel free to be posting those questions as we get into it, and then we'll have the forum at the end to have a more open discussion. So just a reminder, we went through the look at the project and the donor or donors, grantors in combination, and then the design of the project and the supervision of it and what that meant for the team, and sort of how you were basing the work to begin with, which is very relevant to what we're going to talk today and what the speakers will mention, because much of what you set up at the beginning that you said you would do, that you have to talk about at the very end, and the reports that you do are very much the cycle of this work. And then we talked about executing, and then the reports, and starting to prepare your report and prepare for the audit or evaluation or control. And then now today we're coming to the sort of closing out and what it would mean to sustain and kind of work with what you learned and what that means for the project going forward, and for the organization. A couple of reminders in terms of our definitions. We talked about this at the very beginning of the first session back in September, and this is how we're describing a project. The bullets underneath them are things we spent some time on and are important to remember even as we're closing out, because those projects are regularly going to include these results, deliverables, and impact, and the timing and the calendar, which is super important while you're in it, and the budget, of course. And the budget reconciliation is where we are now, and looking back at what the results are from what we said we would do. Also, making sure that we consider who is planning and organizing versus actually managing, because sometimes they're not the same. We know from those of you that have joined before, you have various size organizations, and some of you are doing everything, and some of you are just leading or picking up pieces of it, or you're the grant writer, and there are others who are involved. So important that everyone understands the timing of the project and the direction that it's going. And from our very first session, we talked about the fact that, and the reason I'm bringing this up is that you'll hear as we start to talk about how we account for, both from a financial standpoint, but also from a project delivery standpoint, the alignment with the organization and the project and what that means for going forward, where you've sourced the funds from. It might be multiple locations, it might be one, but what we're trying to make sure you're doing is that you're delivering a clear end point to something that had a beginning point that we described at the beginning of the series of webinars. And also from phase 3 and 4, a couple of things that are bullets that relate to today, because the last section that we're talking about today is much more concise and focused very much on the closeout and the audit and what you do with the information and how you move forward. But all of these things that are in here are the things that have to carry forward and really have to filter into the reports and filter into your next phases. And I think most of the speakers you'll hear from will say, you often are continuing the project. And so if it has value, you'll want to do that and you're moving into your organization and its strategy. So making sure that all of this is kept in mind as we're moving forward. And I said the word cyclical just a few seconds ago, and that's important. And we talked about last time that the linear planning that we sometimes do is not how the project or even the on-ramp or the beginning of the project starts. It's often a cyclical process, and in that you're constantly talking about timing, capacity of the organization and staff, and the scale of the project. And as many of you talked about with us last time, do we have partners? Do we not? Are there multiple funders? And how does that all work together? Because it's not a linear process when we're doing the project. And I borrowed this from one of our last speakers. This is actually something that we have used at our organization, and we previously, Braulio, who brought it forward, we worked on this together, and it's a little confusing to look at, but that is in fact because that is somehow how things go. You start a project, you assess, you go back, you go forward a little bit further, you optimize it, you start doing the work, you get to a certain point and you move back. And where we are is at the very end, which might actually push us back to assessment and then starting the process again, looking at it slightly linearly, but then saying, okay, we're closing out. What does this end of this grant or this end of this project mean? Is it an end? I think Harm said, really, is it an end? So you'll hear more about that from our speakers. But I wanted to bring this back from our last session because I'd kind of forgotten about it, and Braulio brought it forward. So now I get to introduce our stakeholders, our speakers very quickly, and I'm really excited to have them with us. And all coming from very different directions, and I have been acquainted with and run into them in various guises. And I think with our topic in particular, although they could have done any one of the webinars, I think their advice and their experience and their actual activity right now is very meaningful. So we'll go in the order that from left to right that you see on the screen, but I'll quickly introduce them now and then I'll just kind of hand them off. Laura, who I mentioned, is the CEO and founder of Itacha, and that does stand for Innovation, Training, and Adaptation in Coastal Areas. She'll talk about the work that she does, lots of projects, and at varying scales and in varying places. So with her deep experience, I'm very glad to have her with us. And she's in the midst of projects right now, just like our other speakers. And then we have Harm Schoten, who's the director of Eurosite, which is the European Land Conservation Network. And Harm coming with a very strong natural and biology background, and also as the director with lots of different sites in lots of different places in the European context, many projects running at the same time. In various sort of contexts and phases and scales. So really glad to have Harm with us today as well. And last but not least, Emma Sampson, who is Marketing Communications Manager for Serious Business. And Serious Business, she'll tell you some about, is a very interesting organization working on plastics and well beyond, and has an interesting island initiative around plastics. But also having the marketing and communications piece as part of what Emma, as I've seen her do many times on LinkedIn and other places, is to tell the story about what's happening with the project or what's happening on the ground. So really glad to have Emma join us from Serious Business and with the work that they do. So we are going to go in this order. I'm going to hand it off to Laura. And you just tell me when to move slide. Thank you so much,
Stewart. Can you confirm you can hear me now that I've unmuted?
All good.
All right, thank you. You can put the next one. Thank you very much. So as Stewart was saying, I'm CEO and founder of Itacha, which is short for Innovation, Training, Adaptation in Coastal Areas. My background is actually on climate change adaptation, both as a consultant and as an academic. I have worked on this field for over a decade, especially looking at climate vulnerabilities and resilience in small islands within the Caribbean. And 2 years ago, I took a leap of faith to leave my comfortable consulting job at a big consulting firm in the UK and decided to move to Panama, where I had never been before, to start this initiative. And I did so because I saw a real need in supporting Caribbean islands accelerating climate change adaptation. And when you start looking at this as a complex problem for this region, you realize that if you're going to help accelerating climate adaptation, you need to tackle this problem from different fronts at the same time. So what we establish is what we call an octopus strategy, where the business provides different kinds of services. These are the tentacles of the business. And in this way, we're able to tackle the different key barriers and problems that we find around climate change adaptation. So the main services that we're focusing on at the moment are education and training, expert consulting, what we call project development and access to finance, which is really helping startups, companies, and project developers refine the proof of concept of projects that they would want to find finance for, and help them do a matching of finance with international sources. And then what we call scaling up partnerships, which is basically when we manage to support an actor accessing finance for a very interesting climate resilient solution, we try to then see how we can work with that organization to replicate that in other parts of the region. Of course, there are differences between each of the islands, but some of the problems faced due to climate change are very similar in terms of water scarcity, of coastal erosion, of hurricane damage. So we try to see how we can replicate things across the region by building partnerships and forging alliances between actors in these different islands. And the way we manage to, cover so many topics in so many places is due to our structure. So we are structured as what's called a flat organization or a circular organization. There's basically a very small core of C executives that help me drive the vision of the company. And what we do is we set up teams for each project based on the demands that the project has. And that allows us to work really with like local talents. So if we have a project in Jamaica, we'll work with local consultants and local organizations. Same if we're working in Mexico or in Colombia. And that also allows us to have quite a variety of different skill sets in our network of associates, subject matter experts, and partners. And you need this kind of specialty and contextual knowledge in order to work on adaptation, because it's a very contextual problem. Now, these things speak to each other. And what we found is that many times we may start engaging with a particular actor on one of these fronts, and we end up working on another. Because so to give you an example, like right now I'm working with a sea cucumber hatchery here in Panama. That is, it's been established for 2 years, and we started working with them on the project development and access to finance front. So helping them identify suitable financing opportunities for their projects. And this included, looking at what impact investors out there would be interested in this operation, also what grant-making facilities, green credit loans. We looked at the whole spectrum. So we started looking for finance for them, but then we realized that they also needed some education and some expert consulting. So we started doing other activities with them. As a matter of fact, about 6 months ago, I have been working with them for about 1.5 years. 6 months ago, they came to me because they were faced with a very difficult challenge. They were managing a project for the Inter-American Development Bank. They were 6 months into this 18-month project, but they hadn't, done in those first 6 months a good assessment of what they were going to get out of the project. They hadn't done a very detailed budget breakdown. So 6 months in, they realized, oh gosh, we have 12 months to finish this project, and yet we're not yet in a position, to show the results that we want, because we haven't organized our budget and our schedule correctly. So we came in giving expert consulting as project managers. So we took the project since where it was, and we're like, okay, let's do the magic for the next 12 months and make this happen. And And within that project, to give you an idea of the type of activities that an expert consultant brings to this kind of operation, we've been helping them setting up a sustainability strategy. We've been helping them develop a monitoring plan and training local people on how to do environmental monitoring of seagrass areas and areas that we want to manage, for broodstock for sea cucumbers. And we've also been helping developing the relationship with the community so that we can build a outgrower regime where the community participates in the whole production, harvesting, and processing of sea cucumbers once the operation goes, scales up. So in that process, we've kind of like been, doing all things at the same time and helping them scale up partnerships. I persuaded them to join something called the Seaworthy Collective, which is an interesting group of startups in the ocean that are all trying to like combine ideas to find solutions for the Caribbean and for oceans around the world. In the few minutes that I've got before we go to questions, I guess what I'd like to reflect on from my experience, navigating these different services and actors and geographies, there are certainly barriers and opportunities in this space. What I find has been the greatest barrier for us, it's on the accessing finance. And this is for several reasons. Despite the fact that you will hear financial institutions say that they really want to green the financial system, that they want to finance green, which is all true, and it's all now driving new regulations in Europe and in the United States, is driving new types of disclosures and expectations from funds and from investors. The reality is that still the money that is being disbursed for ocean conservation and coastal management is tiny. At the COP, we were discussing this, and it came out that it's about 2% only of the Green Climate Fund are funds that are allocated to the oceans, and 1.6% of overseas development assistance worldwide goes to the blue economy. So we already have an issue that is being raised, and people are starting to act on this to increase the availability of finance. But that's just one of the problems. The other problems emerge towards the projects. And this is, we at least are trying to help startups and small projects that generally the range of what they need is between the $300,000 to the $2 million. And even though it sounds like a big amount and it means a lot to small projects, for financial institutions, what we're finding is the transactional costs are very high. So many of them will say, we'll fund projects if they are 5 million or above. So this niche area, working with small enterprises that are looking for small amounts to kickstart new pilots, to consolidate, their offer, it's a really, really tough area. And what project developers can do to try to facilitate this matchmaking is, from day one, really consider their operation as if it was a commercial operation, and to consider, things like really what is the business plan, what are the returns on these investments, and try to understand how to best align to these funds. Now, there are ways in which you can do that. We find that being clear about how your project or business links to the sustainability development goals is quite useful. It helps funds that are trying to align to specific SDGs to see you, in that space as one of the providers of solutions in that area. Things that are a bit difficult but are very needed is if you're using nature-based solutions within your project, to try to understand really what the profile of that solution is and make the business case for it in your proposals. It's quite difficult because we are talking about natural environments. We're talking about mangroves having a very different risk profile than a seawall, and there being live organisms. They also have a very different, expectancy of when they will operate. But it's very important that you start thinking about this business case for nature-based solutions within the projects. Those to me are some of the big challenges. I don't want to over exceed the time, but you've allocated me, Stuart. We can talk about them later. But that's definitely one of the areas where I think businesses can share experiences between each other and try to seek assistance to present better proposals to financial institutions that show how they are aligned with SDGs, what the business case is for their product or service, and where possible, how that business model is including nature and natural capital, as part of their solutions. I will leave it at there. I'm sure people may have questions. I'm more than happy. As you can see, we work across different topics as well. Blue economy, nature-based solutions, and food security primarily. So I'm more than happy to answer those, or if other questions emerge in the discussion, I'll keep an eye on the chat nonetheless.
Great. Thank you so much. And you brought up a number of points that when we think about what we do next, because if we consider that we're coming to the end of a project, what does it mean? What have we gathered? How do we reach additional funders, like you've noted? And I also think we'll make sure we talk about this. Project typology, especially if it's a nature-based solution project that some of you are doing, may have a very different timeline in terms of its impact, even if you're doing recording and reporting on a project, because the grant itself is finished. We talk about this a lot in my work, that we're on a long-term plan, even if programs and projects are sometimes shorter and the funder is asking for a report about what happened. So let's keep that in mind. And now I'm going to turn us to Harm from Eurosite. Over to you, Harm. You can unmute and let's hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you for the invitation to talk. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay, well, my name is Harm Schoten. I work for Eurosite since the beginning of this year. And in my previous life, I worked for BirdLife International, mainly in Europe and the Netherlands. And we had some very nice coastal projects. One of my latest projects for BirdLife was the opening of a coastal area. The Netherlands is built with a lot of dikes, and we were able to open some of the dikes for salmon and other fish to be able to swim into our land. And that was a really big project funded by the Dutch Postcode Lottery, so a kind of institutional funder. These kind of projects are really interesting because they're kind of their capital. They want to invest, and that gives you a lot of freedom during a project to be able to increase the impact of a project. Well, Eurosite is a different organization. We are a European network of conservation organizations. We have 75 members in 24 European countries. It's pan-European. And a lot of our nature conservation organizations or governmental organizations, they work along the coast. So Conservatoire Littoral in France, Tour du Vala. We have Italy, Greece, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, UK, Scotland, Ireland. They're in our network. And Eurosite is connected to the International Land Conservation Network. That's coming from the US, but has, in the meantime, has built up a program worldwide. The vision of Eurosite is to develop a strong and effective community of European land conservation practitioners. So our main target, the main focus is on the site manager. So what we do is we represent the site managers and the conservation organization at the EU level. That's an important role, but maybe even more important role is we work on sharing knowledge between conservationists. So we organize a lot of twinning, training, knowledge exchange, and we work a lot on funding applications together with a broad partnership for projects. One of the main interesting things is that we organize a lot of study tours and field workshops. So really in the field with all site managers together, policymakers present, and in a very good atmosphere, we discuss possibilities. For example, last year, A few months ago, I was in Marseille at the IUCN Congress, and we discussed with Tour du Volat in the coastal region of the Camargue a lot about how nature-based solutions can contribute to a more sustainable way of managing these areas. Well, Eurosite has 8 working groups. There are thematic working groups specifically on conservation. I will mention a few of them because I think they're interesting for you. One of them is the Wetlands and Climate Change Working Group, really working on climate change adaptation and mitigation connected to wetlands. We have the Management Planning Working Group. We have the Remote Sensing Support Group, because a lot of the monitoring these days is done with advanced and digital skills. We have the Agriculture and Biodiversity Working Group, the Peatland Restoration Working Group, and Conservation Finance Working Group. So we have a lot of working groups where an organization from all over Europe work together on specific themes, and also trying to develop funding applications for these kind of work. Then about projects, we have, of course, like Laura said, we have a diverse range of projects, and also a wide range in budget, ranging from, in our case, from 10K to a couple of million euros. We have a lot of EU funding applications, and more of these EU funding possibilities have a green aspect in it. So we have the regular ones. For example, LIFE is a very well-known funding scheme for nature conservation. Eurosite also has a LIFE operating grant, which means that for our operating duties, just as an organization, we get money from the EU because the EU thinks that certain organizations are of relevance to be able to implement and to achieve their policy objectives. But the interesting part is that more and more of the other applications and funding schemes are looking towards greening Europe. And the Green Deal and the climate change is very important. So currently we have Horizon projects, which are more research-oriented projects. We have Erasmus+, which is a very successful funding scheme on training and education. And it's even doubled in this new period because of its success in the previous period. And then we have Interreg. Interreg is a funding scheme which connects regions together. And I know that Interreg also takes a look at coastal areas. And there are several Interreg projects looking at coastal areas and twinning between, for example, France and the UK. So these kind of funds are very interesting. And then, of course, we have a lot of institutional funds. Well, I can talk a lot about these projects, but maybe an interesting example for you is the way how we look at a project. I put 3 theses here about closing a project, because the topic of today is closing a project. And well, as I said to Stuart, when I think about it, I think I never actually closed down projects. Maybe some smaller ones, but we were always able to expand the work on projects and to make a smooth transition to a new phase, to part 2, part 3 of a project. So my first thesis is closing a project is a pity. And of course, a project should fit within your own strategy. Yeah? So that's also something that Stuart said. It's a building block in a bigger program. So what we do is we have a lot of funding applications during a current project to be able to expand the project in the afterlife. And what we also have is that we have projects and we create partnerships and stakeholder groups and working groups within these projects. We want to sustain these groups after the project. So it's very important to find money and funds and support for the phase after the project. And a good proposal, a good example is our work for peatlands. because you might be aware that peatlands is a very important topic during climate change discussions. We all talk about reforestation, but you might know that peatlands are even more important for fighting the climate emergency than reforestation. But the peatlands contain twice as much carbon compared to all the forests worldwide together. So what we do a lot of work on peatland restoration. We did in the past, our organizational members in every country, they worked on small individual peatland projects. And then a couple of years ago, we started combining them and making a bigger story of it under the umbrella of climate change. So now we have an Interreg project, we have several live projects, we are working with the Global Peatlands Initiative, we have an European Peatlands Initiative, which we just started at the COP26 in Glasgow. And all these building blocks create a kind of program where in the long term, and that's also to do with the ecosystem situation, that restoration of ecosystems takes a really long time, and in the case of peatlands, it even takes centuries. And then, so the connection between the money coming from a funder and the final project results in case of peatlands is we will not be there when the project result is delivered, and that's an interesting thing to know. But for example, in one of these projects, in the CarePeat Interreg project, we created a project group on peatland management, peatland restoration and management. And what we want to do is to keep this working group also after the project life, after 2023, when the project is closed down, we will still be able to support the peatland restoration management group by other means. My second thesis is that a strict auditor is a blessing. And I'm really serious about it, because I'm very happy what we have, for example, in our live operating grant, we have very strict auditors and quite looking very tight to the deliverables we have to achieve. But that's really helpful, because it gives us a perfect accountability, a legitimacy is really excellent. So the danger in the end of the project is really low, that we will not be able to report on what we have proposed to deliver. Yeah, and then the third and last thesis I have is that evaluating project afterwards is a waste of time. And I mean that as a joke, but I think you have to evaluate your project constantly, of course, so already during the project. And if you find any new insights after the project, then you have done something wrong. So you should be earlier during the project. You already need to think about the lessons you are learning at the moment. So that's my story for now, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A together.
Thank you, Harm. I think we've lost Stuart for a few seconds, so he might just be back. But I can see he's. Are you still there, Stuart?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Then sorry. I think
that's so strange. I was asking Harm a question, or referring to a question we would get to about funding a network. So I'm not sure what happened. Are you able to hear me okay right now?
Yeah, but can you question? Or?
Yeah, I was more or less saying that as a network, there's a few registrants who are networks or a coalition, and that's a particularly interesting piece for something that, you know, whether a project ends or not when you're a network. And so we should come back to that too and see if there are any questions that are specific to that, because that is one of my jobs, and it's very difficult to raise for the network portion, although you're doing incredible project and program work. So I can hear why you don't want it to end, because it's probably something that can live on with the network too. So and this new peatlands one is very interesting. So I just want you to kind of think about that, and we'll come back to that after we hear from Emma and get through some of the other slides. But and be sure and let me know if you guys lose me again, because I was following right along and I don't know, not sure what happened. So Emma, let's go to you.
Hello, thank you. We only lost you for a second, by the way. I'm Emma Sampson. I work for Serious Business. I am in the marketing and communications. So most of my background is in communications, about telling stories, not in project management. However, particularly at the end of a project, communications really comes to the front as a really important thing that happens after a project ends. Serious Business is a circular plastics consultancy based in the Netherlands, in Eindhoven. We're a small company, only 8 employees at the moment, but we are a very impact-driven commercial company, which helps businesses and organizations to turn their plastic into a more circular use. So that can be through reduction or recycling, or including recycled content, changing your whole business model towards reducing your plastic impact. As well as the more commercial projects, we also do undertake some major systemic projects funded by institutional donors on a more international scale. We're able to use then our expertise that we've learned by working with our commercial customers and in business development, and apply them to larger contexts with multi-stakeholders. We're running a couple of these projects at the moment. One of them is in Morocco, where we are helping supermarkets in Morocco to move away from single-use plastics by introducing a deposit return system for PET bottles to encourage bottle-to-bottle recycling, and also introducing reusable food containers into the supermarkets at the delicatessen counters. The second project that we're running is on some small island states, six island states in total, 3 in the Caribbean: Antigua, Barbuda, Grenada, and St. Lucia, and 3 in the Pacific: Fiji, Vanuatu, and Samoa. This project is funded by the IUCN and also financially supported by the Norwegian Agency Development Corporation. It's been running for over 2 years, and it is coming to an end this month, supposedly. Like you were saying, projects tend not to end, they tend to be extended, fingers crossed. But that's kind of where my role comes in communicating and keeping it going. The project is examining the plastic pathways on these islands in 3 major sectors: in the tourist sector, fisheries, and waste management. We looked and analysed all the plastic that is produced on the island, not plastic that washes up onto the island, plastic that is generated on the island itself, because at the moment it is dealt with quite badly. There is no formal recycling situation whatsoever. Everything goes into uncapped landfills or is incinerated. So this is about trying to find different pathways for this recycled waste. We have come up with 9 solutions for the plastic waste: bottle-to-bottle recycling, net-to-net for fishing industry, reusable packaging in hotels and restaurants and other tourist industries, and some waste product solutions. Now, we've produced a blueprint at the end of this project of all these prototypes and pilots, and we've proved the business case. And now it's up to the local stakeholders to take that on or to roll out upscaling. And I think that's where the role of communications come in, because to keep the project going, we have to keep telling the story, keep engaging, keep the interest high, and also to continue promote things so we can try and secure a second round of funding, but also to inspire new projects from both business side and from institutional donors. Can continue talking about that unless there are any specific questions.
No, that's great, and you've touched on exactly the two major points that made me feel like it would be a great part of the discussion today in terms of the communication. I'm going to switch us now back to the methodological guide. Please, for participants, have your questions ready and post them for us, and Marta and Cyril and I will monitor them. And we will get to them. And after this, this next section, we will jump into the Q&A. So just a quick bit of the methodological guide. You'll hear reinforcement on some of the comments that were made from our speakers. And I just wanted to thank all three of you because you gave us lots of topics for discussion. And as was desired, lots of different angles on what it means to finish, use, evaluate, move into, or expand and scale or partner as a project or a grant for that particular project, because there's a difference, ends and where we go with it. So this last bit, first, some guiding comments, because this is something, and this is this is sometimes the unfun part of doing the work that comes when you are grant funded. And that's really a set of guiding comments, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail. But first of all, the fact that if you did what Harm was saying and you were doing evaluation all the way along, and that by the time a one-time final report, if that's the case, has come due, bring that forward and have it reviewed again by someone with fresh eyes, and don't wait till the last minute to get that in, because there will be questions afterwards, and especially if the money has been spent down in the project, quote unquote, at least that portion of it has been finished, being able to move on to the next phase, whatever that might be, sooner is better, especially if they're going to do an evaluation of some kind. Now, getting the submission done correctly, I've seen it go badly a few different times. This sounds simple, but especially if it's a combination of paper and digital, or even with all digital, making sure that all the proper attachments and appendices and things that support your case, especially if you want more funding for an extension of the project, to show what you've done to communicate the work, deliver the project, and manage it well from a financial and a product or project delivery standpoint. And that means going all the way back to our first session where we talked about making sure that you have good registration and sign-ins, and keeping clips from newspapers or any kind of social media or anything that you have that really documents the success of the process, and making sure that's included and noted along with the financials, of course. Often it's the financials that they're looking at, but it is also those delivery items. One mistake I've also seen early on in small organizations is that they send in the report and they haven't kept an entire report and its attachments for themselves to go back to, especially if the project, and this is going to be different for all of you, if the project is something that's more research-based or training-based or development of a product itself, relating to some of the stuff that, say, Serious Business does, or is it, as Harm noted, something like a nature-based solution that takes a half a century to grow back in the proper way and show the actual impact that it's supposed to. So what are the various things that you need to do to show the activity and the success of it up to the point where the project is still running? So keeping that in hand and keeping that for yourself, especially for further projects or other funders, is really important. One thing that is important also is that if these are interim reports and you have one every couple of years for a long-term grant, or there's one every 6 months, making sure that you're not using that as a case necessarily for amendments to your grant, but using it to report out where you are, but always keeping in touch with the funder. One of the things that came up last time, and I think two of our speakers mentioned it directly, and that was to be very, very transparent with your funders and continue to keep them posted all the way along, so that when you go to do a report, there's no surprises, either from the deliverables and impact or with the funding itself. But don't use that report necessarily as a moment of contention or debate, because they're not looking for that right at that moment. So staying in touch with them is really important. Every single grant will be different, but be familiar with the budgeting and their requirements, and it may be a combination of requirements. They're definitely not going to be the same from grant to grant. And I'll note later on that making sure that if it's a partnership and there's multiple funders on one project, that you've got some alignment and synchronicity in the way that you're accounting for your activity and for the financials, especially if there's pass-through grants or contractors that are being hired. And we talked a little bit about that last time. So making sure, and these are very simple formulas you see here that come right out of the methodological guide, but making sure that you're accounting for the money in the way that they are paying forward on, or if you're doing it all through an expense-based process. Because we also talked about the fact that if you're doing it through an expense-based process, your organizational cash flow can be hurt by the fact that you're doing it in that expense-based way. And if there's a delay on paying you back expenses, it can hurt your general organizational cash flow. So just making sure that you're kind of keeping a regular accounting. And I know this sounds hard, especially if you're a newer organization, because you might not have all the financial tools or accounting tools or financial staff in place. But as soon as somebody is possible, even in the simplest terms of keeping track of the budget is really important, so that when it comes time to do these calculations, you can do it quickly. So preparing for the audit, there's almost always going to be some time of evaluation or audit. I've rarely seen where there isn't, and I know most of us have experienced that as well. Some of you that have registered for this have had this experience yourself as well. And most funders will use this as the kind of closeout. You may have submitted your report and all of the attachments, and then you don't hear for a while. So it could be that you don't do the closeout until a little bit later, and being ready and prepared for that is important. And I mentioned this, but one audit with a group of funders is really important, especially if you can align it to the most strict, and avoiding multiple versions for multiple funders and having it more consistent. You'll thank yourself, but if you have finance people, they're definitely going to thank you. And not having to do it and cut those numbers in a lot of different ways. Almost always you're going to have to put in for the audit purposes balance sheets, and there may be balance sheets or audit requirements that are for like a 2 or 3 year grant required every 6 months or something like that. So you want to make sure that you're ready for that at whatever time it comes. And one note about getting to the very end, if there is an end, is you may not have the same program staff. The program staff may have moved on to a new project, or as in many cases, the program staff or project staff run the project, they run the program, and they are not the ones necessarily doing all the back end work. And so making sure, and we mentioned this in the very first webinar, making sure that all the staff and their alignment is really good, so that you're not having to chase people down. And if somebody leaves, that's one thing, but keeping people in your organization all up to date is really important. And Harm kind of said it. He said it in a different way. A strong auditor might mean a blessing, but that's the same thing with the good reporting and record keeping. If you've done that along the way, it's really important and can really move things along, speed things along, and if nothing else, make it easier when the audit time comes. So a few of these things we've touched on. They're going to look to the work plan and the goals. You'll remember our definitions and the way that we described outputs, outcomes, and the way that indicators and metrics are applied, and the difference between them and what they'll want to see. Granted, with a lot of the nature-based work, your outcomes and outputs might be very different on a time scale. And so training might be considered your outcome because that's what the project was designed to do, but that the true outcome of their work or the follow-on may be something longer and deeper. Making sure that you're clear on all those material proof, digital records, finance, and tagging them and connecting them to the project early on so that it's easier at the far end. Making sure that all the eligible targets and participants and geographies, this goes back to making sure that you've said, we're going to work on X island and X community or an X shoreline area, and these are the people we're working with, and that you've tracked that work with those stakeholders. Super important. And also just the personnel connected to this, whether it's contractors, making sure that timesheets, the contracts themselves and their expenditures and the reporting back on them are all included in this. Any of the non-program related costs, if you've got overhead that they agree to, whether it's 10%, 25%, Harm noted his Horizon grants. We just received 3 different versions of some Horizon grants, and the EU has very different reporting requirements than, say, a general private funder or a small foundation or something like that. So making sure that you really make sure the difference between the program and non-program costs in your indirect versus direct. And I think it goes without saying, but those big funders are going to have much more detailed requirements and go much deeper. And it may require the kinds of activity ahead of time as you go to do the grant. But if it's not done ahead of time, they're definitely going to follow up on it. I'm in the process of a grant right now, and they're asking for incredible detail ahead of time. And it's a significant grant, so they should be, but the detail on finances and all of the pieces that are expected to be reported on later are very, very extensive. So we'll pause there before we get to the next session, and we'll see if we have any questions that have come up in the question box. Marta, I don't know if you've seen any. I haven't been monitoring that while I've been talking. If not, I'll jump into some questions for our speakers.
Yes, sorry, can you hear me well?
Yep.
Okay. So one of the questions, sorry, I'll just get it quickly. And that one of the question is basically once you are assessing your project, what is one of the common mistakes that beneficiary can make in highlighting how the project will continue in time? Because it's generally something that all the funders are expecting. And so what would you say is a common mistake to kind of maybe say too much or exaggerate the kind of results that you think will continue in time, and what is the best what's the best way to still be, honest about the results of your project, but also impress the funder and in the hope that you might get a second funding later on?
Ooh, that's the $1 million question or $1 billion question. Who wants to jump in and take that one first? That's the tricky balance.
I'm happy to reflect on it a little bit. I think setting the expectations right from the beginning is very important. I mean, you clearly want to aspire to do many things within a project, but you need to also be realistic, about what can be achieved within. Generally, these projects are, like 12 months, 18 months, and sometimes the things that are needed will take longer, so setting the expectation right and learning objectives of pilots is very important. I've found many times, that the project developer, in order to try to succeed at an application, will oversell, what they are doing. And this is because obviously they know they're in a competitive environment. They need to highlight best that they can their project so that they win it, but it can be counterproductive in the longer run, because if you set out achievements within the proposal that cannot be met, that's going to give the idea to the funder that either you hadn't set your expectations right, you were not realistic about what to do. I think it's always better to tell the truth, and it can still be a compelling story, than to try to oversell in a proposal. That does not mean that you cannot give a very good proposal with what you need and what you are going to do. You can do that, in the way that you describe and kind of embed, things about your business, your vision, your longer term aspirations within what a project can do. But I see this happen over and over, and then you end up kind of like, as we say in Spanish, like trying to put down the fire, because you've set out, we're going to do lots of things, and then you can't. So I think it's very important to try to set those expectations right. I think, when you talk with certain kinds of financial institutions, say, for example, I work a lot with the Inter-American Development Bank LAB, which is for the early stages of project development and startup growth. They're very aware, that along the way you will find barriers, that you will find challenges, that not all objectives may be met. And so for organizations that are in this kind of like accelerator role or helping small businesses, what for them is really important is that you have kept a track record of what has been done, what has worked and what hasn't worked, and the lessons learned. Where are you at the end of the project in the context of how you approach this problem? Has your vision changed? Has the way in which you're going to approach it changed? So this track keeping is not just important for auditing, but also in a more reflective manner to be able to help you write those lessons learned that will help accelerators see that you have made your best effort to advance your solution or your problem. I don't think there's the sweet spot that is not that easy to find. Stewart says is the $1 billion question. But what I would say is just it's also very important, that even if you're getting a grant, that you think carefully about the financial sustainability of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. It is now, many organizations would expect that even if they're giving you a grant, that through the grant you're setting out activities that will provide some form of cash flow or return to the activity that will see it in the longer term being sustainably financially sustainable and viable without the need of continuous grant making. I see this a lot, for example, or things that have worked on conservation. I worked a lot with coral reef conservation organizations. They're now bringing in, for example, the tourism model, the training people to help at the nurseries as a way to develop cash flow outside of grants. There are many other economic activities you can try to embed in your business model to make it more financially sustainable. If you cannot find a financially sustainable way to operate, then you may have to rephrase or rethink aspects of your business model. Because I think that what we see as well is that organizations that have been naturally always leaning to just giving grants, they are strengthening their mandate to ensure that this money also helps raising other funds. So co-financing is becoming way more important than it was 5 years ago. That co-financing can come in many ways. You can get creative. You can do in-kind contributions. Your own time, the time of your staff can go as co-financing. But it is expected that more co-finance is applied, to grants, and it is expected that the projects can show to be sustainable in a financial manner. So these things will become more and more important, I think, with time. I'm not giving you the straight answer, I'm afraid, but it is a difficult question.
That's good. That's good. Emma and Harm, thoughts to add to Laura's about the big question of you balance, you know, the expectations of that funder as you approach them and as you end.
For us, it's quite difficult to give accurate impact measurement, for instance, on plastic saved, because that data is going to come far after the project has ended. Although we do get as much data as possible so that we can put it in front of people, and then you've, of course, made projections on what can happen in the future. But a lot of the time, it can be more of the storytelling aspects which also add value there. So, you know, we do satisfaction surveys, user testimonials, those sorts of things as well, to prove that the project has worked and has legs to continue. But exaggeration probably is not a good plan.
Yeah. Harm?
Yeah, maybe to add very shortly to this, because I think you're quite complete here, is that the discussions we have with grant providers are more and more on the impact. They're not looking directly for project results, but for a broader impact, and how to describe this impact is quite complicated. And so we have a lot of negotiations at the beginning of a project, before we even receive the grant and have our signature. And sometimes that also leads to the situation that we don't accept the grant if a grant provider really wants something we cannot deliver. We really have to stay within our own capacities and our limited situation. So I would say only propose or only agree to something you are really sure about you can deliver.
I'm glad you brought up the saying no part, because I was going to mention that sometimes you may find yourself where you're fine with the project and you learn from it and you're done and you want to move on, and it might be in that negotiation process, or it might be early on. I mentioned the one we're working on right now. The level of detail is just unbelievable. And so, you know, on the one hand, it will be good if it all works out. On the other, it's an incredible amount of work to get to the point of potentially getting a grant or not. And so, you know, being very transparent on both ends is I think, is very important. It goes back to what we talked about in terms of alignment to your organization too. We mentioned early on more than once that if you're grant chasing just to get started, sometimes that works. But if you're an established organization with a strategy and you're grant chasing and it takes you off mission, that's a dangerous path, even if it's a large amount of money, because it may not be something you can deliver on. So those are great questions. Switching gears a little bit, there was a question from the audience about IFC, and I don't know the answer to this question myself. And the question is whether IFC does an audit at the end of the project. Do either of you have IFC funds or no?
I mean, considering that, I'm not 100% sure of the answer, but considering that they have such a strong, framework for assessing and managing environmental and social risks, and very strong guidance on their safeguards, I would say that they possibly do. I mean, there is something called the IFC board toolkit, and within that, I know they have like audit and compliance assessment tools. So this would be, understanding whether a project has, acceptable, very good, or best, in practice achieved their results. But I don't know if it changes from type to project or type of financial support given to another. I would, however, expect that they do have to audit their projects because they're being audited. The performance of the IFC has to provide annual reports on the impact of their transactions. So that what they report on would align to what they request from the projects to report on. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has more details on IFC.
Yeah, I mean, I was involved with one project and there were interim reports, but it was a very long-term project, so I'm not sure what their normal audit process is. All I know is that every 6 months we were having to, which was good. It made us do accounting on all fronts every 6 months, but I don't really know the details on the audit side. But
yeah, I can tell you IDB does, like the projects that I do with IDB Lab, you do have 6 month reports that you need to issue, you know, they have a specific template for that. And these are actually, it's very good that you have this kind of interim audit activities, because that's also a moment where you can highlight anything that's going wrong, that it's not going according to plan. You can explain why maybe some things have been delayed. And that basically kind of, you know, helps the funder also adjust its expectations to the final date. If you've had an 18-month project and you haven't set or raised any issues for 18 months, and then the last day you're halfway where you're supposed to be, it's going to be very challenging for the funder to understand the why. So
yeah.
Take these audits as an opportunity for yourself as well, you know, to bring in any issues, to discuss and raise any concerns.
Yeah, agreed. I think if you're waiting to the end, it's already too late. Okay, great. So we're gonna move on with the methodological guide, and then we'll come back to another round of Q&A. Great. So and this flows right into. And these will be some quick slides, and we'll get to conversation. This really flows into a lot of what we had just discussed, and to some extent, what's come up in the answers to the questions that we had from the audience already. One thing I threw in here is from session 2, there was one slide where we talked about marketing and communication tools and combining those with monitoring processes. And so this relates to part of what Emma said and what this section is about, and that is, if you can start early and you have a good set of tools, or you start to develop them, you can then use all of that for what comes at the end. Whether you're going to continue the project, write a new grant, go to other funders, or whatever the story might be, are you going to be able to bring things from the very moment of the award announcement and the kickoff and everything along the way, and what you're doing on the ground, and all the social media, and what the funder or grantor wants to be involved in. We have some projects right now, for instance, that are really co-run or co-developed with a couple of funders, the Ocean Conservancy and Circulate Initiative. They are our partners, not just the funder. And so there are lots and lots of things that go out about the process and the project phase and the materials that are there. All of that is great to report on afterwards for them and their funders, and for us and our funders. But it's also something that helps tell the story to new funders. If you're going to scale it, you're going to expand it, and it's really part of the organizational strategy, which this particular project that I'm referring to is. And if at all possible, and this is what Emma's good at and what Serious Business I See does a lot, you're basically using the work as storytelling, and the storytelling as the impact collection and documentation. So it's not just marketing, it's not just the communications, it's really sort of changing hearts and minds and policy and project development. And that's really important. So I just wanted to bring back that slide because now we're going to talk about, if it is the end, or at least the end of this phase, what do we do to create value? So there's the marketing and social media stuff that I just mentioned, both visual and written. But what if your project is something that's very heavy research based and requires a white paper, or there's a report with it? Is there something to learn that you can then share, even if it's not part of the project? And this gets tricky because it'll affect your budgets, but is it something that can move into another project, into another funder? Is it something that you can use as results to do more training and technical assistance that is paid, unpaid, and other funders doing, but is expanding your impact? Which of course, all funders like to hear about that when it kind of rolls out into more impact. And it's been mentioned a few times, are you tied to the strategy of the organization? Is there something in that program that's meant to grow, like you've heard mentioned from the speakers? Or is it something that it's going to move into another area? Are you closing it out? But going all the way back to that idea of the organizational strategy, is it something that supports that? And I took a quote from Awatef. Awatef is one of my colleagues on the evaluation committee for Smilo. And I thought what she said was really good, because that is in fact sort of the tension that we have here. Considering the state of sustainability, and it's tied to the organization, and is it a one-shot type project, and you would hope to say no every single time, that leads to no added value? We're hoping that it's something different than that, and that it's encouraged and talked about all the way through, which gets back to why it's important to talk to the funder along the way, because even if things aren't going quite right, it may have a good outcome at the end that they like, and that can be added on to the greater value. So creating a plan around that and being able to take it out further is important. And speaking of plan, if it's marketing and awareness and communication, there's an entire set of campaign elements that you can start to plan for at the very beginning. It actually relates to a whole kind of campaign process that we didn't talk about too much in the first webinar, but as part of that project, there may be a whole set of communication teams at the funder, at your organization, at other partners who are working together on a whole kind of series of drum beats, if you will, for the work of the project as it goes along, especially if it's the kind that's pulling data, experiences, visual and written, that can be used to kind of create more. And does the funder demand that? Are they involved? Or do you need to get it from somewhere else and they're not even wanting to be involved in it? So it's sort of very different. If you want it to lean towards education and research, and really a deeper set of learning, it's going to require you more resources. So getting back to the overpromising, you don't want to say to a funder, from this project, we're going to now go do X in terms of learning and sharing. If they're not paying for it and you haven't really looked at where it covers somewhere else, it's a good idea, but you should find the way to get that and be able to move it out without it hurting your sort of general operating or your general operations as an organization. And if it's discussed with the funder and they say no, then you should immediately know that if you're developing a campaign or there's a learning plan that comes after this idea of exploiting is the word that's used in the guide, but using that for something more has to be planned out early, because resources are going to be involved, and you'd hope that the funder would pay for it, even if the project is starting to wane and you're moving into another phase of it. And so therefore, this is a before, during, and after situation. And there's I'll mention a sort of closeout wrap-up list, but the before, during, and after really refers to the project and also for the organization. So what in the plan that's coming at the end that might be part of the value capitalization and further work, can you set up ahead of time, and does it align with the work that you're doing? Who are the targets? What's the various forms of media and dissemination? What are those outcomes and outputs, and how do they get described in terms of impact and change? Who are the media themselves, internally and externally? Who are your partners in this? Do you have champions and spokespersons that are stepping forward and are part of the project that you can use and you have quotes from? And it might be those champions are people on the ground in where the project's working, or it might be someone else at another level or another organization as the project really starts to gain speed and gain impact. One of the things that I love to harp on a little bit is how we translate really deep, dense data into visualizations and storytelling. How do we make that easy for people to understand? Especially if you're working with local stakeholders who then have to sort of prove to their citizenry or to a partner who sits in a municipality or a government of any kind, how do you translate the visualization and storytelling appropriately so that each of those targets are being met, and you can use it at a later point to really move it out. Question yourself whether this is getting transferred to a new grant, a new program, or another partner, and how that looks. And I didn't know we would mention it so much, but keep talking to the funder early and throughout. Don't let them be surprised. You should not be surprised about something that comes through in the work necessarily. You should know as it's being monitored and as you're doing the work, but certainly they should not hear from you just before something closes out that it's gone differently. And then as we end, and before I do the actual wrap-up piece and have more Q&A, there was a section at the back of the guide that I thought was really good in terms of these dimensions. And I'm not going to go into detail into them, but thinking through the various dimensions that a project has innately also reflects on what you might say your organization is or does. What are the dimensions of it? And I think that personal, social, technical, etc., all is worth viewing kind of in hindsight, but at the forefront too, as you go to work on a project. And the source for that is in the book, and you can see it down below. But I'd not seen it before, and until the book was worked on. And I thought it was an interesting way of looking at what a project has or is. But I also realized that part of that is what you think of your organization. And especially if you're an organization that's networked like HARMS, does the network keep a certain set of these dimensions for itself? And then all the members have their own as well. So I thought it was a worthwhile way to end this section. And we'll move on to a little bit more Q&A before I do the actual wrap up and talk about the cycle again. So I don't even know if any more questions have come in. I think there are a couple. Everybody turn their cameras on. So I think this one could be for anybody, but and it might be just even the language we're using. But the first question is, what do we mean by transferring to a new grant? And what do we mean by that? And I have my view of it, but I'll turn it to our speakers first. Somebody want to grab that one? Go ahead, Hunt.
Maybe before going into this question, I want to respond a bit to your story about the communication part, because it really appealed to me, what you said, and it's very interesting that usually a project is built based on the content or based on the communication. Sometimes there are two separate worlds, and or often there are two separate worlds, and the communication is often an end of pipeline situation. So that's really a difficulty. So we're trying to, within Eurosite, we're trying to change the situation, and we have a broad Eurosite strategy for the upcoming 5 years about reach, resilience, relevance, and recognition. And then we create a separate communication strategy under the lead of the broad strategy, where we try to improve and change the way we communicate. And as you said, it's all about storytelling. It's about personalizing the stories you want to tell. It's about telling about impact. And it's a real challenge for us, because we are the experts, and now we are looking for different target groups. We want to broaden the scope of our network. We want to broaden the scope of our partnership. It means that we have to talk to different audience. We have to talk to farmers, to private landowners, but also to wider audience. So, for example, what we are preparing right now is a campaign on peatlands, and it's a social media campaign. It's only about youth. So the climate is youth is working for the climate, and now we present young people standing in nature areas on boardwalks, and they telling about the importance of nature for climate change. And it's a completely different way of working for us. And a lot of our members in our network already do that. So we're trying to keep along with them and improve our cooperation. And that these kind of communications are really interesting for funders. And when I see that especially a lot of the institutional funders and the grant providers we work with, if you want to have another fund or another application in the upcoming periods, then you need to be able to show that you told the story in a good way. And we also have research projects, and that's sometimes then you need to provide articles in important journals, etc. But when you talk to institutional funders, and then you need to be able to present videos, websites, etc. And so you have to be very flexible in that sense. Yeah. And yeah, transferring a grant means trying to, in my view, trying to connect. To feel the funder, to make the funder interesting in the second part. Once you've done the first part, he or she should be really interested in what comes next and how can we achieve an even bigger impact. And yeah, that's the way we try to work.
Yeah, that's what I intend when I say transfer. On the communication front, I mean, I think you bring up a point that was incredibly relevant during COVID, and I don't know, many of you may have experienced this, but a lot of the work had to shift, and it had to shift to doing things at a distance. And some of these things were very on the ground, and it just so happened that in the one project I was describing on Urban Ocean, they were able to train people digitally who went out and did the work and did an amazing job of recording things on their iPhone, on their phones, and videos and photos of them working. And they themselves became the champions of the work, which was incredible. It was what was intended, but it was because of COVID and the lack of being able to be on the ground with them that they had to do it themselves. So they were trained to do this in case plastics monitoring. And show themselves doing it and take pictures and do videos. And they used it to support the work that they were doing in each of these communities. And it was fantastic, slightly unplanned. And that's the kind of adjustment that I think funders appreciate. And you have to be really transparent about it. And thank goodness they were our partner in it. And we're like, yes, this is amazing, go ahead. So I hear you, it's not always the standard, but thinking about it very early on is important. Emma and Laura, comments on the communications piece and or on this question about transferring to new grant, or the question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, we also found exactly the same with COVID, not being able to visit the islands ourselves and being so distanced from everybody, everyone being closed away, that getting videos from people and photographs and things was incredibly important. And also we wish we'd collected more, like as much as possible. And if we undertake the next project, we will just start collecting from the very beginning, because it's been so useful towards the end of the project. Now we're trying to create animations and live video, and trying to get that footage after the effect is very difficult. So it's really handy if you collect things from the very beginning all the way along, even if it doesn't seem useful, just collect everything you can, because you don't know when you're going to need it at the end. And at the moment now we're trying to hopefully get an extension, because these pilots they've begun, but everything's taking an awful lot longer also with COVID. So these sorts of things are really important to show like the progress of the project and what could happen next. So yeah, transfer of a grant, I think that's extending, upscaling, that sort of thing, securing a second round or an additional funder.
Yeah, if you have all that good data and a good report, maybe it's another funder who picks it up. You would hope so if you've created some momentum already. Laura, do you want to add to that?
No, I think they're all very, very good points. I guess the only thing I would add about the value of, like, having videos, having images that record the progress is not just only for the benefit of that project, but for others and for others around the world that may be interested to replicate, the the kind of activities that you're undertaking. Just yesterday, I was giving a workshop at Puerto Lindo with the community that we're trying to inspire to become, a part of an outgrower regime for sea cucumbers. And I had the opportunity to show them how this is being done in Madagascar. There was a 6-minute video that explained how they have managed to do it. And you could see seeing how others are doing it really changes things. You're not only talking in the abstract. Yes, you're talking about something new here, but this is something that has been done elsewhere. It can be achieved. It can be done. It's been done by people just like you somewhere else. And I really feel that for the benefit of replication, of passing experiences to others, to inspire, these kind of images are very compelling. They tell a story that I cannot tell just by showing someone a project, in a chart or in a budget or in Excel. It tells the story of people, of other people that they can relate to. So to me, I think it's very important. And it's very important that even if a project ends, most projects now and grants have a component of knowledge dissemination embedded within them. Not all do, but even if they don't do, write blogs about it, show on YouTube what you have done, give others the opportunity to learn from you. And to, for me, it was so valuable to have Blue Ventures having done that video 3 years ago, because it's now something that I can help land here in Panama. So don't ever forget about how what you're doing can inspire others, and make sure that you share that along the way.
Yeah, that's great. And your response just now on something you said, Laura, takes me to this other question about, do you think it's a good strategy to communicate the outcome from funds obtained, for example, through social media? And I know what my response is to that, because unless the funder says no or they're an anonymous donor, I think you talk about it as much as you can from the moment you get the grant and you announce the project. But over to you guys. How do you feel about it and using social media for that?
Our funders have very strict communication guidelines of things you're allowed to say, what colors you're allowed to use, what fonts, what logos, the wording, the order of the logos. You have to be very, very careful. And we communicate just up to the limit and a little bit further, to be honest, as much as we can. And we find that the IUCN in particular does a lot of communication itself, but it's very official, very formal, long reports, and it's not particularly personal. So we try to go from the more personal storytelling aspect to show the people on the islands doing things to, like you say, name your champions, like make it a real story, make it engaging for a general audience. It also helps to try and sell that project to the press, to the media, to get into events if you have something interesting to tell and not just tables of numbers. Yeah, social media is massively important, obviously, because it's so huge, but also it keeps a conversation going with your local stakeholders and your local partners also. Especially, we've just noticed that on Facebook, we would never really concentrate on Facebook because it's not really our target market, but a lot of the ministries and the local groups that we're working with are more active on Facebook than they are on LinkedIn or Twitter, for example. So we really want to keep them engaged and interested and feel part of it also. So we find that's really important to keep that going.
Karma, I think I saw you right here.
To add, because I think we learned it the hard way, and we still make a lot of mistakes in this area, because we have a lot of projects, we have a lot of funders, and it's quite difficult in the stress of the daily work to always think of mentioning everybody, and and sometimes it's even sensitive. So you have to be careful when mentioning a donor. Some of these organizations or institutional funders don't want to be mentioned in certain situations. So it's always a kind of sensitive and quite difficult thing to do, but it's very important you don't forget about it and you have clear lines. And for example, the last months, I think several of our funders came to us and said, well, why aren't we there with our logo? And then we had to say, yes, we forgot you. So So be careful.
Yeah, and I think this actually gets to some of our earliest sessions where knowing exactly what what role they want to play. It's rare that a funder is as close to the work that we're doing on, for instance, on Urban Ocean. They literally are our partner, co-designer, funder, on the ground people, trainers, bringing people in and helping bring funders as well. If you have somebody that's slightly more distant and you haven't worked that out with them, then you might find out later on, that they expected that their logo would be shown in each of those cases. There's also a question here, and I think this actually relates to more about the audit, the where of what they buy with their contribution. This gets to some points that are in the book, in the guide. The question I think is more around the auditing that they're doing. And there's a little paragraph in the methodological guide that describes how if you've been given the part of the grant is to do some marketing and you're buying what we like to call swag, and it's got logos, and you're buying pens and different types of marketing materials, and you might have water bottles or certain things that you do. Keeping examples of that and keeping an accounting of that specifically is really important. There's a little note in the guide about having almost given away everything that they bought with the money from the funder, and the funder never saw what they looked like or got copies of those things. And it's a good point to, in addition to the sort of more concrete financial and deliverable pieces, that if you have the ability to keep some stuff aside and say, hey, look, here's what we did with it, and here's your logo, and here's what it was on, and here are the people we gave it to, and sort of the word getting out. And I think that's still really important. Let's see.
Just one thing, Stuart. I think there's an interesting question that comes from Mohamed Amezian, and also kind of is related to what Martina Gagliotti was trying to also ask. And it's so I'll just read the question really quickly. But the question is related to communicating to the funders about reaching a goal after the end of the project's period, say 2 to more years after. In some cases, we know from the beginning that one of the main goals, sorry, I'm having troubles reading it, of the project cannot be reached during the time frame. So how much time then can you use also the logos of the funders? Or after a certain time, you should just stop using them, for example, less than a year after the project's period ends? Or what are your advice on that?
Did everybody get that? So it's a great question. Say it's a 2-year project. You've been doing things and communicating and working on it, and you've been using their logo and sort of representing who they are and what their involvement is. But the project is actually truly, the impact is much longer. Do you keep using their logo? Do you keep referring to them? How long does that go on? And I remember this happening in some projects that I've been on. What are your thoughts on that? Like, where do you draw the line to say it's not really yours anymore? Go ahead.
Okay, it's quite a complex question, but because there's a real variety of projects, and it's mainly about the products, and the deliverables of the projects, and they're so different. So everything that is produced during the project needs to have the logo, and it's sustained that way. We, for example, do a lot of nature conservation projects in the field, and it often ends with a sign in the field, and there is the logo for eternity. So it's very important to keep it there, and it's also about reports, etc. But I can also imagine that there are more vague circumstances, and then I would be a bit reluctant 2 years after a project to use a logo from a funder. I would first, before doing that, I would connect to the funder and ask his or her permission. That would be my idea.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I was just thinking and also wanting to refer to Laura. You look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the best approach if you're unsure is when you're having this closing of project calls and discussions and those final interactions, to leave that clarified, to clarify, okay, so for how long would you expect us to keep acknowledging you in the work that we do, or how, I always have, like, in kickoff calls and closing calls, communications, as one of the things that you need to agree, how we're going to communicate internally and how we're going to communicate externally. So even if the project is ending, it's important to agree on how is this going to be communicated externally into the future, rather than inferring or making hypotheses about what a funder may expect. It's always best to ask, so that you're not causing, then you're not going outside of the frame that they would expect projects to communicate their work.
Yeah, and I think Harm kind of touched on what part of the answer I would have given or I've used in trainings before, and that is to kind of look at the project typology too, because if it's a project where you're creating something, like here's the report, or here's the beach restoration, or here's the giant wall, or there are things that, like, you can put logos on and they remain, because that report in a PDF is sitting on the website and it still says XYZ Foundation, or the sign at the beach restoration, or the big project. You see those with, governors and mayors and presidents' names, along with other funders and things like that. I think where it gets tricky, and I have a project right now where we're working on a tool that's a resilience finance tool, and there's been 2 funders already. I keep referring to them, but I don't necessarily use their logos every time. And I think that's really a question to what Laura's saying, is that if you have that ongoing communication, what's the funder saying about that? In this case, I know they don't care if a year from now their logo's on it, but they should be given credit for believing in the project at the beginning. And so I try to do that at least verbally, but often in a PowerPoint slide too. So I think there's a mix of ways, but I think to answer the question more directly, there's probably a typology we would look at and see whether or not it's been communicated, logo on a sign, logo on a report, or whatever it might be.
And maybe just to complete that's all those great answers from Smiley's experience, also one good way is if you're still hesitating and it's not necessarily a deliverable, so it's not something that's going to print and leave there forever, but just something you might still want to be communicating about. A good way is just to tag on social media posts, tag your funders, even some that are just, could be interested in the results of the activity that you're conducting. It's a good way to still show them that you care about, you've thought of them, because sometimes just especially smaller associations and organizations just tend to forget to tag and show their funders what they're doing, and I think that's a very easy way to do it.
Yeah, Martha, I'm really glad you said something about social media. There are some funders, for instance, who I think are so engaged in the social media sectors and platforms that for them, just that kind of connection and the hashtagging and their, them being tagged in Instagram posts really makes them feel involved. And I can see it with Smilo's work and with the Conservatoire. You can see who's tagged, and that they've seen it because then they're liking it or they're responding to it. So that's also it's a very clever way to kind of keep alive the feeling, because years later somebody could retweet or repost something and it could still have their tag on it, right? And so unlike 10, 15 years ago, some of their connection lives on even if the project has moved on. I think we got to all of, there's a list of them. Yeah, we answered that. Yes. Great. I think people are starting to drift off because we reached the sort of the point. So Marta, any other questions that you saw that I missed or anything you want to ask?
No, I think all the questions were answered. I don't know if we still have a lot of time, but if there are any questions left, please, to the audience, we can maybe take a last one, but I think we've answered all of them for the moment.
Yeah, we're just starting to get
Yeah.
thank yous. So speakers, just so you know, very useful, a lot of great comments. The wrap up was pretty simple. In addition to making sure everybody knows that they should get in touch to get their certificate, I just wanted to leave everybody with the idea that they go back if they haven't seen all the details of the three sessions, because they'll be on the YouTube station, but also think about the kind of iterative process that we've talked about, because we could have done, you know, deep 3-part sessions on just, you know, one section of this entire webinar, right? So it was just a way of getting you engaged and through the process. So get that certificate, make sure you have the methodological guide, but be thinking about this cycle of projects and what it means for your timing, scale, and capacity, and what the iterative process could be teaching you. And I know we talked a lot about the end and about the communications, but you also heard from everybody, a lot of this begins at the very beginning, right? So begin at the beginning, as they say. And sometimes those will follow you all the way through and then on to the greater life of the project and the organization. So I think that's it. We are running out of time. So many thanks to all of you, the speakers, and for all your contributions. I feel like we could have kept going and had a lot of deep conversations and some storytelling ourselves around the experiences, and some great synergies and similarities while very different backgrounds. So really want to thank all three of you for providing your time and your expertise, knowledge today. So thanks all three of you. And thanks to those that have joined us as well, and to the Conservatoire and Marta and Cyril, Smilo. Great way to end the session. And Marta, you want to leave us with your final word?
I just wanted to thank you, Harm, Emma, and Laura, for taking the time to be with us. We will hopefully remain in contact after the workshops in case of any future opportunities to collaborate. And thank you to all the participants. Again, for those that have participated in the 3 sessions, remember, if you want, you can have a certificate, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you for the invitation, Stuart.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. Look forward to teaming up some work with all three of you as time goes on. So
take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.